Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that glows like a candle flickering against a storm. The life of a man who saw colour in darkness, beauty in sadness, and infinity in the swirl of a night sky. His name, of course, is Vincent van Gogh. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love imagining all of us scattered across different cities and time zones, quietly connected by one thing, a story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1853 in a small Dutch village called Zundert. The church bells are slow and heavy, the sky overcast, and in the local parsonage a baby cries loudly as if protesting his own arrival. His name is Vincent Willem van Gogh, and from the very beginning something about him feels different. But here's the first mystery. The name Vincent wasn't new. There was already another Vincent van Gogh, his stillborn brother, buried in the churchyard just outside the house, under a gravestone that bears the same name and birth date. Every Sunday, the family walks past that grave. Every Sunday, little Vincent sees his own name carved in stone. Tell me, if you were that child, wouldn't that do something to your sense of existence? Would you wonder whether you were meant to live someone else's unfinished life? Historians still debate how much that early shadow shaped him, but there's a quiet consensus. It never really left him. That gravestone was his first mirror, one that reflected not his face, but his fragility. He grows up pale, restless and watchful, the kind of child who notices the small things others miss, the trembling of leaves before rain, the way light bends on a glass of milk, the sadness behind a smile. His father, Theodorus, is a strict Protestant pastor, his mother, Anna, a lover of flowers and sketching. Between sermons and still life studies, Vincent learns two opposing languages, duty and beauty, and somewhere in between, he gets lost. By his teenage years, Vincent is awkward, intense, a little too passionate about everything. He doesn't flirt, doesn't play, doesn't belong. People whisper that he's a little off. He stares too long at paintings. He talks too earnestly about God. He writes letters that sound like prayers and reads the Bible as if it were a secret art manual. At 16, he starts working for an art dealership, the famous Goupil and C, thanks to an uncle's connection. It should have been a dream, surrounded by paintings, travelling between The Hague, London and Paris. But Vincent isn't good at pretending to like what sells. He looks at polished portraits of rich clients and mutters, "They look so empty." That's not the kind of comment that wins promotions. In London, something in him begins to unravel. He falls in love with his landlady's daughter, the first and maybe only time he ever experiences anything like real affection, and she rejects him, not cruelly, but firmly. He spirals, his letters grow darker, he stops shaving, stops eating properly, starts walking for miles in the rain. People around him say he's too serious for life. Maybe they're right. Maybe the problem isn't the world around him. Maybe it's the way he feels everything too deeply. One rainy morning he wakes up and decides, enough of art, enough of commerce. He wants to serve something pure, something meaningful. He writes to his family that he's becoming a preacher. His father approves. His employers breathe a sigh of relief. But if you think this is the part where he finds peace, well, think again. In the coal mining region of Borinage, Belgium, Vincent arrives with a Bible in one hand and a torch of idealism in the other. He sleeps on the floor, gives away his clothes to the poor, and tends to the sick miners like a saint out of a novel. But to his superiors, he's too extreme. They fire him for being, ironically, too Christian. Imagine that, losing your calling because you actually meant it. The villagers adore him, but the church rejects him. The tension between faith and rejection becomes a scar he'll paint again and again in different forms. Peasants bowed under candlelight, workers hunched in prayer, faces rough but radiant. And it's here, in the grey dust of the mines, surrounded by broken lives and soot-stained faces, that Vincent begins to draw, first out of pity, then out of purpose. He sketches with whatever he can find: burnt sticks, bits of coal, broken pencils. His first subjects aren't angels or saints. They're miners, beggars, old women, people who, like him, have nothing left but endurance. Art historians still argue about this moment. Was this when he became an artist, or was it when he stopped being everything else? What's certain is this: in those rough, dark sketches, you can already see the pulse of the man who would one day paint Starry Night. And though Vincent didn't know it yet, he had already traded the safety of faith for the chaos of creation. The boy who once stared at his own name on a gravestone had begun to carve another, one that would outlive the silence of every church bell in Zundert. Paris, 1886. The city is a blur of colour, perfume and noise. The streets hum with laughter, cafe chatter and the clinking of glasses under gaslight. Somewhere between Montmartre and madness, Vincent van Gogh steps off the train with a battered suitcase, smelling faintly of turpentine and tobacco, and absolutely no idea that this city is about to change everything he knows about art and himself. For 33 years, he's been a shadow in his own life. But Paris, that electric heart of the 19th century, is where he finally begins to glow. He moves in with his brother Theo, who works as an art dealer and loves him more than anyone ever has or ever will. Theo, patient and soft-spoken, sees what others can't, a raw, stubborn spark that might yet become genius. Their small apartment fills quickly with canvases, oil fumes, and conversations that run deep into the night. It's here that Vincent first meets the Impressionists. He's nervous, awkward, intense, that man who never quite knows when to stop talking, but they welcome him anyway. There's Monet with his shimmering light, Pissarro, the gentle mentor, Degas, sharp-tongued and brilliant, and Gauguin, dark, magnetic, already dangerous. They are rebels of colour, heretics of tradition, and they see in Vincent not competition, but a kind of beautiful chaos. The first time he sees their work, it's like being struck by lightning. Gone are the dark browns and greys of his Dutch period. In their place, colour, reds that vibrate, blues that hum, yellows that burn like sunlight trapped in paint. Vincent writes to Theo that he feels like someone who's been blind and suddenly sees. And you can see it too. The transformation is instant, like a man stepping out of a cave into the open sky. He starts painting still lifes of flowers, shoes, and cafes, each one a small explosion of emotion. He mixes colours straight from the tube, sometimes even with his hands. He learns from Monet's airiness, from Seurat's dots, from Toulouse-Lautrec's theatrical flair. But make no mistake, he isn't copying them. He's absorbing them, like a sponge soaking up every hue of modernity. And then something happens that even his peers don't expect. He starts outpacing them. In less than 2 years, his palette evolves from imitation to invention. He's no longer painting what he sees, he's painting what he feels. Every brushstroke becomes a heartbeat, every colour a mood. But genius has a cost, and Vincent is paying it in sleepless nights and trembling hands. He paints for hours, sometimes without eating. He drinks absinthe for courage, coffee for survival, and turpentine. Well, sometimes by mistake. His friends worry, Theo worries most. "You're burning yourself up," he says. Vincent just smiles. A candle burns brightest before it dies. In the cafes of Montmartre, he argues about art and love and God. He talks about finding the sacred in the ordinary. He laughs too loudly, gestures too wildly, and sketches on napkins until they're covered in smudged ink and passion. People begin to whisper that he's mad. But the thing is, he isn't, not yet. He's just too alive. There's a painting from this time that captures it perfectly. Portrait of Père Tanguy. An old paint dealer sits calmly against a background bursting with Japanese prints and colour. It's peaceful and frantic at once, like Vincent himself, a mind at war disguised as serenity. That's another secret most people miss. Van Gogh adored Japanese art. The flat compositions, the clean lines, the stillness, they were everything his own soul wasn't. He once said, "All my work is founded on Japanese art." And it's true. From the almond blossoms to the minimalist contours of a bridge, you can see Japan through every stroke. Yet beneath the calm, his restlessness grows. He writes in his letters that the Paris life, the crowds, the noise, the endless opinions, feels like a swarm of bees around his head. He longs for the countryside, for sunflowers and silence. The Impressionists are thriving, showing in salons and selling their work. Vincent, meanwhile, can't sell a single painting. Still, Theo never gives up. "They'll understand one day," he says. But Vincent, ever the doubter, answers softly, "Perhaps, but not while I'm alive." There's a strange beauty in that awareness. He knows he's creating for a world that doesn't yet exist, a world that will one day see what he sees when he looks at a wheat field or a chair or a patch of blue sky. And so he paints faster, more furiously. His brush becomes his pulse. His canvases fill with rhythm, with vibration, with something beyond the visual, an emotional electricity that no one has quite captured before. He's standing at the edge of something revolutionary, but he's also standing at the edge of himself. The city that gave him colour is beginning to suffocate him. The laughter in the cafes starts to sound like noise. The lights of Paris blur into a dizzy halo. One evening he looks out from his tiny apartment window, watches the sky fade from gold to violet, and whispers to Theo, "I need to find my own light." Theo nods. He doesn't argue. He just packs his brother's brushes, his paints, and a few coins. A few days later, Vincent boards another train, this time heading south. He doesn't know it yet, but in that blinding light of Arles, under fields of sunflowers and skies that never sleep, he's about to create the most famous colours the world has ever seen. There are moments in life when something inside you dies quietly, not with noise, not with drama, but like a candle that runs out of air. For Vincent van Gogh, that moment came on a freezing winter morning in a small mining town called Borinage. The coal dust hung in the air like fog, the kind that stings your throat when you breathe. Black smoke poured from the chimneys, and men with hollow eyes trudged toward the mines before sunrise. Vincent stood at the edge of that world, clutching a Bible in one hand and his own uncertainty in the other. He had come here as a missionary. He wanted to bring comfort to the poor, to speak of God's light to those who lived underground. But the deeper he walked into Borinage, the more he realized that words had no power here. What use were sermons when your audience was starving? Vincent tried. God knows he tried. He preached with fire, visited the sick, prayed in damp cottages. But when he saw a miner with bandaged hands, when he smelled the acrid smoke of burning coal, something inside him cracked. He began giving away everything he had, his clothes, his bedding, his shoes, even his food. He lived like the miners, ate what they ate, slept on straw. He wanted to share their suffering completely, as if that might make his message more real. It didn't. The church officials called it excessive zeal. They said he was bringing shame to his position. Within months, they dismissed him. No job, no home, just the echo of failure and a bitter wind that swept through the valley. For days, Vincent wandered the Belgian countryside with no clear direction. Sometimes he stayed in barns, sometimes he sketched. It wasn't art yet, not in the way he would later understand it, but more like a desperate attempt to hold on to something human. He drew what he saw, the bent backs of miners, the faces of widows, the tired hands that told whole stories in their wrinkles. There was no beauty in them, only truth, raw and unpolished. But perhaps that was what he needed, to stop speaking about suffering and start seeing it. That's when the first spark appeared, small, almost accidental. A thought that maybe he could tell these people's stories, not with sermons, but with images. He began to sketch more, charcoal, pencil, whatever he could find. He copied from anatomy manuals, studied the structure of hands, the slope of shoulders. He devoured books about drawing and perspective like they were holy texts. And in those long, cold nights, he wrote to the one person who still believed in him, his younger brother Theo. Theo was working in Paris as an art dealer, surrounded by the very world Vincent had failed to enter years before. But he never treated Vincent like a failure. He wrote gently, encouragingly, with patience that felt almost parental. "If you can't preach, Vincent," Theo once wrote, "perhaps you can still speak with colour." Vincent didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but the idea lodged itself somewhere deep. He rented a tiny room, filled it with sketches of workers, old women, and worn shoes. He studied from dawn till night, his hands always blackened by charcoal dust. He drew until his fingers cramped and the candlelight blurred his eyes. There's something sacred about that kind of obsession, the quiet, unseen devotion that no one else believes in. He was 30 years old. He had failed as a preacher, as an art dealer, as a teacher, but for the first time, he didn't feel lost. He began to travel again, first to his parents' home in Etten, then to The Hague, where he sought formal instruction from his cousin-in-law, the painter Anton Mauve. Mauve was part of the Hague school, those Dutch realists who painted in smoky tones and grey light. Under Mauve's influence, Vincent began to see the world differently. "Draw what you love," Mauve told him once. Vincent hesitated. "I love people." "Then draw them," Mauve said, "but draw them honestly." That single word, honestly, changed everything. Vincent threw himself into it. He sketched seamstresses bent over sewing machines, farmers mending nets, women peeling potatoes by the dim glow of a lamp. He didn't idealize them. He drew them as they were, tired, flawed, real. Every line was an act of empathy. Every smudge was a prayer. When he wrote to Theo about his progress, his letters grew more confident, even tender. It seems to me that the real artist is he who feels everything deeply and then chooses to paint not what is beautiful, but what is true. There was still struggle, always. He quarrelled with Mauve, ran short of money, fell in love disastrously with a woman named Sienne, a former prostitute who became both his model and companion. The neighbours were scandalised. His family disapproved, but Vincent, ever the stubborn romantic, saw her as part of the same human dignity he wanted to defend through his art. He drew her with her child, tenderly, protectively, a Madonna in poverty. It was never about rebellion. It was compassion taken to its limit. He moved constantly, The Hague, Drenthe, Nieuwenan, each place leaving marks on his spirit. But the transformation was happening quietly, steadily. The failed preacher was becoming a painter of souls. His style deepened, thickened. The lines grew heavier, the tones darker. The people in his work seemed carved from earth itself, rooted in the soil they worked. These weren't portraits, they were icons of endurance. He told Theo, "I am no longer trying to paint prettiness. I am trying to paint life. And if life was sometimes ugly, then so be it." By 1884, Vincent's entire world had turned into a study of the working class, the peasants, the spinners, the ploughmen. He watched them eat, labour and pray. He visited their cottages where the air smelled of smoke and boiled potatoes. He painted by the dim light of oil lamps, trying to capture the warmth and fatigue that lived in their faces. What emerged from this period was not yet genius, not the swirling brilliance of his later years, but it was something even more important: honesty. He was still clumsy with colour, still learning composition, but the emotion was already there, beating beneath every stroke. In 1885, in a small Dutch village called Nieuwenan, Vincent painted the work that would define this phase of his life: the potato eaters. It was the culmination of everything he had felt since Borinage: the compassion, the guilt, the longing for truth. 5 peasants sit around a rough wooden table, their hands coarse, their faces tired. The only light comes from a small oil lamp, casting long shadows over the room. They share a single meal of potatoes, their own harvest, and their expressions carry both weariness and peace. To Vincent, it was sacred. To the art critics, it was ugly, but he didn't care. "I wanted to show," he wrote to Theo, "that they have earned their food honestly, that they have tilled the earth themselves, and therefore I find them truly human." When The Potato Eaters was finished, Vincent was exhausted. But in that exhaustion, something magnificent had been born. He was no longer preaching God's word, but something just as divine: the dignity of ordinary life. He didn't know it yet, but this painting, dark, sombre, rejected, would become the foundation of everything he would later achieve. The hands that had once held a Bible now held a brush, and through it Vincent had found a new language, one that required no translation, no church, no approval. The transformation was complete. The preacher had become the painter, and the colour, the real blinding colour, was still waiting just beyond the horizon. After the intensity of Borinage and the early experiments in Nuenen, Vincent van Gogh's world was coated in shades of grey and brown. The Dutch countryside, with its low skies and endless fields, became both his canvas and his classroom. Here he explored the grit of life, the raw textures, the earthy tones, the quiet dignity of labour, in a way that no one had yet done. Vincent moved into a small, draughty house in Nuenen, the kind where the wind whistles through cracks in the walls and the floorboards groan under every step. Every morning he rose before dawn, his breath misting in the cold air, and walked through muddy paths to observe the villagers. He watched women carrying water from the wells, men bending under sacks of grain, children trailing behind with bare feet blackened by soil. It was during these walks that he truly began to feel the lives of his subjects, their fatigue, their resilience, their silent beauty. Unlike the Impressionists he would meet later, Vincent wasn't interested in light as a fleeting effect. He wanted permanence, substance, weight. Every fold of fabric, every calloused hand, every shadow cast by candlelight told a story, and he recorded it with meticulous attention. By 1885, he had completed The Potato Eaters, a work that has since become iconic but was then controversial and misunderstood. The painting depicts 5 peasants around a dimly lit table, their faces harsh, their hands rough, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. It wasn't polished or idealized. It was honest, raw, human. Vincent wanted the world to see that the toil and struggle of ordinary people were worthy of reverence, yet critics dismissed it as ugly, clumsy, even grotesque. But he didn't falter. He once wrote to Theo, "I want to show that we all eat our potatoes in some form, yet some see only the peel, not the effort beneath." Even in rejection, Vincent felt a quiet triumph. He had captured something true. During this period, Vincent also experimented with technique in ways that were unusual, even for a student of realism. He layered thick, rough strokes on his canvases, sometimes scraping and reapplying paint to emphasize texture. Art historians have debated why he did this. Some say it was a reflection of his obsession with material reality. Others argue it hinted at the emotional turbulence simmering beneath his disciplined exterior. There's no consensus, and the debate continues today. Interestingly, amidst this intensity, Vincent also held a fascination with minor, almost whimsical details. He collected old shoes discarded by villagers and painted them with painstaking care, turning mundane objects into studies of life's resilience. Shoes became more than footwear. They were symbols of journeys, labor, and the human footprint left upon the earth. He even painted pairs of boots worn thin by farmers, carefully noting the shape of every crease. It was an eccentricity that some contemporaries found odd, but to Vincent it was an exploration of narrative through objects. While his palette was dominated by earthy tones, deep browns, muted greens, dark ochres, Vincent was already beginning to experiment with contrast. He introduced sudden flashes of lighter colour, small hints of hope amidst the shadows. It was a visual metaphor. Even in hardship, life persisted, stubborn and luminous. The Dutch shadows were not only physical, they mirrored the turbulence in his own mind. Vincent was intensely introspective, prone to deep melancholy. Letters from this period reveal a man wrestling with the weight of existence, questioning God, art, and purpose simultaneously. Yet this introspection, rather than paralyzing him, fueled his creativity. The depth of human struggle he observed daily became the emotional backbone of his work. Vincent's commitment to truth over prettiness, to empathy over convention, set the stage for his later explorations of colour and light. It was in Nuenen that he honed the emotional intensity that would define his mature style. The Dutch shadows, heavy and pervasive, were a crucible. Within them he learned discipline, observation, and patience, skills that would later allow him to transform landscapes, night skies, and sunflowers into expressions of emotional brilliance. By the end of his Nuenen period, Vincent's portfolio had expanded to include studies of peasants, interiors, cottages, and still lifes. Every piece, while dark and sombre, carried an undercurrent of life, movement, and authenticity. He was building not just a body of work, but a philosophy that art should reflect the totality of existence, its toil, its modest joys, and its quiet dignity. And yet, as much as he had mastered shadows, a new horizon beckoned. Paris awaited with its light, its colour, and its radical break from tradition. Vincent's earthy realism, no matter how intense, could only go so far before the vibrancy of the wider world demanded to be seen. The Dutch landscapes and dimly lit cottages had taught him patience, empathy, and depth, but they had also prepared him for the explosion of colour that would define the next chapter of his life. By 1886, Vincent van Gogh had endured the grey winters and earthy shadows of the Dutch countryside long enough to know the weight of realism. He had painted the grit of life, the toil of peasants, the glow of candlelight on rough hands. Yet, for all its honesty, his palette had been limited. Deep browns, muted greens, ochres of the soil. He was ready for something more: light, colour, and the chaotic vibrancy of the modern world. He arrived in Paris in March, stepping onto the bustling streets of Montmartre with a suitcase of sketches, a box of paints, and a heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. The city was alive. Streetcars rattled on cobblestones, cafes overflowed with laughter, artists' arguments, and the scent of coffee and bread. Gas lamps flickered against the misty evening air. Every corner seemed to hum with possibilities. Theo, his younger brother and confidant, welcomed him into a small apartment that was cluttered with canvases, books, and letters. Theo's support was unwavering. He provided space, supplies, and most importantly, belief. For Vincent, this was both comforting and disorienting. He had spent years struggling in near isolation, consumed by his own intensity. Now he was surrounded by a world brimming with artists, ideas, and the dazzling noise of Parisian life. It didn't take long for Vincent to encounter the Impressionists, Monet, Pissarro, Degas, and Toulouse-Lautrec, the rebels of colour and light. Their works shimmered with a vibrancy that he had never experienced. Monet's landscapes seemed to breathe. Pissarro's villages glowed in the dawn. Degas captured fleeting motion with elegance, and Toulouse-Lautrec painted nightlife with bold, theatrical flair. Vincent was both thrilled and overwhelmed. He studied them obsessively, trying to absorb every lesson they offered. He copied their brush strokes, experimented with their techniques, and even mixed colours in ways that made him tremble with excitement. The grey and brown of his Dutch period began to give way to a newfound luminosity. Reds vibrated, blues hummed, and yellows seemed to burst from the canvas. It was as if he had been blind, and now, for the first time, he could see. Yet Vincent was never a mere imitator. He absorbed the innovations of the Impressionists and immediately filtered them through his own sensibilities. Where they captured fleeting moments, he sought the eternal. Where they painted surface light, he painted emotion. Every stroke, every hue became a measure of his inner state, an extension of his own intensity and vulnerability. He was not without struggle. Paris was crowded, chaotic, and expensive. Vincent often painted for hours without eating, fueled by coffee, absinthe, or sheer obsession. He argued with fellow artists, clashed with landlords, and fell into emotional turbulence that he chronicled endlessly in letters to Theo. And yet, in the whirlwind, he began to find his voice. Flowers, cafes, urban streets, and intimate portraits filled his canvases. He painted the humble, everyday objects he had always revered: boots, chairs, tools, but now with a vibrancy and immediacy that breathed life into them. He experimented with Japanese prints, incorporating their flat planes, bold outlines, and compositional clarity. He wrote to Theo that these influences were a revelation, allowing him to explore both simplicity and emotional depth. Despite the excitement, Vincent sometimes felt lost amidst Parisian brilliance. The city's frenetic pace overwhelmed him, and he longed for space, silence, and fields of sunflowers stretching toward the horizon. Nevertheless, his Paris years were crucial. They expanded his visual vocabulary, taught him the power of color and light, and prepared him for the explosive creativity that awaited in the south of France. By the end of his Paris period, Vincent's style had begun to merge the intensity of his Dutch realism with the vibrancy of French impressionism. He had discovered that color could convey emotion, that light could suggest inner life, and that every canvas could be a vessel for both observation and feeling. This period also deepened his philosophical engagement with art. He believed that painting should communicate truth, not merely beauty, and that every brushstroke should carry the weight of feeling. Art historians still debate how much of his later brilliance was seeded during these Paris years, but the consensus is clear. Without Paris, the luminous intensity of his later works, from Arles to Saint-Remy, would have been unimaginable. Vincent himself seemed to sense the approaching threshold. He painted rapidly, obsessively, as if trying to absorb every lesson the city had to offer before moving on. The world outside was noisy and bright, but the fire inside him was growing. Soon the earthy shadows of the Netherlands and the vibrant, chaotic light of Paris would converge in a new realm, a place where colour, emotion, and imagination collided. That place, as he would discover, was Arles. By early 1888, Vincent van Gogh was ready for a radical shift. Paris had taught him colour, the delicate interplay of light, and the infectious energy of the modern world. But the city's constant noise, its crowded streets, and relentless movement pressed against his soul. He longed for space, for sunlight, for wind, for a sky so wide it could swallow his restlessness. And so he looked south. Arles, in Provence, called to him like a promise. Rolling fields of wheat stretched beneath vast blue skies. Olive trees bent gracefully in the Mediterranean breeze. Villagers moved through narrow streets lined with ochre buildings, their laughter and chatter carried by warm, fragrant air. For Vincent, it was as if he had stepped into a living painting, a place where every colour glowed more intensely than any canvas could contain. He rented rooms in a modest house with yellow walls, a choice he later described as instinctive. Yellow, he wrote to Theo, was the colour of warmth, of sunlight trapped on walls, of hope itself. The house would soon become legendary, the yellow house, a beacon for his vision and his dreams. He painted its exterior with vibrant ochre, capturing the way the sun fractured and shifted across its surface throughout the day. But the Yellow House was more than architecture. It was a statement, a declaration that he intended to live fully within his art, to immerse himself so completely in colour that it would saturate every facet of his existence. Each room became a study, each window a canvas, each corner a composition. Here, for the first time, Vincent felt the possibility of building a community of artists, a place where creativity could flourish without compromise. He famously invited Paul Gauguin to join him, envisioning a collaborative studio that would rival the great salons of Paris. Gauguin arrived months later, and though their partnership promised brilliance, it would also become fraught with tension, rivalry, and emotional volatility. But for now, the dream was alive. They painted together, argued about technique and philosophy, and drank absinthe into the quiet Arles nights. Meanwhile, Vincent turned his attention to the simplest subjects, the ones he had always loved, but now imbued with a new vibrancy. Sunflowers became emblematic. He painted them in every stage, budding, full bloom, drooping, and decayed. Each canvas was an ode to life itself, a meditation on growth, light, and mortality. But unlike a mere botanical study, Vincent's sunflowers pulsed with emotion. Thick, curling brushstrokes captured not just petals, but the very energy of the sun itself. Yellow, gold, ochre, and amber swirled together in a rhythm that almost vibrated off the canvas. He was fascinated by repetition, the idea that a subject could be explored endlessly, revealing new truths each time. There is a story, still debated by art historians, that he painted the sunflowers with such intensity that the pigments themselves seemed to shimmer and shift in the sunlight. Some say he used colours so saturated that the canvases reflected his emotional state, a brilliance bordering on mania. Others argue that the effect was intentional, a deliberate attempt to communicate vitality. Either way, the sunflowers were no longer just plants. They were avatars of life, of light, and of Vincent's own fiery soul. Beyond the sunflowers, he captured Arles's streets, the market, the cafes, the fields, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. He painted the night sky above the Rhone River, experimenting with swirling lines and deep blues that would later evolve into the famous Starry Night. Even in the mundane, a chair, a boot, a vase of flowers, he found emotional resonance. Each object carried weight, history, and intimacy. To him, art was not decoration, it was presence. Vincent also explored portraiture in Arles, attempting to capture the essence of those around him. Local inhabitants, innkeepers, labourers, neighbours, became subjects for studies in colour and character. He painted Père Tanguy, a quiet paint dealer whose shop was filled with Japanese prints, as well as other residents whose personalities he distilled onto canvas. Every stroke was deliberate, every colour a subtle emotional cue. And yet, even in this sunlit paradise, darkness lurked at the edges. Vincent's letters reveal the turbulence of his mind, bouts of depression, insomnia, and obsessive compulsions that made him work for hours without pause. He oscillated between elation and despair, painting with feverish intensity in bursts that sometimes lasted days. The Yellow House, meant as a sanctuary, also became a crucible. His genius thrived here, but so did his fragility. His collaboration with Gauguin, though brimming with potential, exposed the volatility of his temperament. They argued incessantly over style, philosophy, and approach. Gauguin admired Vincent's emotional intensity, but was unsettled by his erratic behaviour. The tension culminated in the infamous incident where Vincent, in a fit of despair and confusion, mutilated his own ear. The act shocked the community and remains one of the most discussed moments in art history. Scholars continue to debate the precise circumstances and motivations behind it, a mixture of mental illness, creative frustration, and interpersonal conflict. Despite these personal crises, Arles was a period of unparalleled productivity. Vincent created more than 200 paintings during this time, each imbued with the southern light he had long sought. He experimented with complementary colours, bold outlines, and expressive brushwork, developing a style that was unmistakably his own. Fields of wheat, sunflowers, olive groves, and night skies became the signature motifs of his Arles period, celebrated today for their emotional intensity and technical innovation. The Yellow House itself was meant to be a commune of creativity, and even though the dream faltered, the idea persisted that artists could live and work together, learn from one another, and share the intensity of their vision. Vincent's vision was not just aesthetic but social. He wanted art to be a living, breathing community, not just an isolated pursuit. Interestingly, his fascination with Japanese prints continued to inform his Arles work. He experimented with flattened perspectives, bold outlines, and strategic color contrasts. Unlike in Paris, here the influence merged with his emotional realism, creating a unique fusion of Japanese precision and Western passion. Scholars continue to debate how much of his later post-impressionist techniques were seeded during this period. The consensus is that without Arles, the intensity and audacity of his later works would have been unimaginable. Sunlight, wind, and color merged with his inner turbulence, giving birth to paintings that were both joyous and poignant, alive and introspective. Arles was where Vincent fully realized that art was not simply representation, but communication, a way to transmit the inner life to the outer world, a bridge between mind and canvas, soul and observer. In Letters to Theo, Vincent wrote of the sunflowers, "I want to do something entirely new, something that bursts from the canvas like light itself. I want people to feel it as if they were standing in the field with me." This obsessive vision, the blend of light, emotion, and unrelenting passion, defined the Arles period. And yet there was always tension between the external and internal worlds. The Arles sun shone brilliantly, but inside Vincent, storms still raged. Sleep was fleeting, meals were inconsistent, and isolation often pressed in despite the bustling town. The Yellow House offered both inspiration and confrontation, a place where colour and light could flourish, but where the edges of genius and fragility were always dangerously close. By the end of 1888, Arles had transformed Vincent van Gogh. He was no longer the introspective, struggling artist of the Netherlands or the absorbing student of Paris. He was a creator of extraordinary intensity, capable of turning sunlight into pigment, wind into brush strokes, and emotion into visual symphony. The Yellow House and its sunflowers were not merely subjects, they were manifestations of his vision, foreshadowing the brilliance and tragedy that would define his final years. Arles was not just a setting, it was a crucible. It was where light met shadow, joy met despair, and imagination collided with raw emotion. The paintings he produced here remain enduring testaments to the power of vision, the intensity of passion, and the fragility of genius. In the quiet of Provence, Vincent understood something essential. Colour could speak, light could sing, and a single canvas could carry the weight of the human soul. He was no longer searching for the world to recognize him. He was painting for life itself, fierce, unrelenting, and luminously alive. By May 1889, the intensity of Arles had reached a breaking point. The yellow house, the sunflowers, the rhythm of the Provençal light, they had offered Vincent van Gogh inspiration, but also exposed the fragility of his mind. The incident with Gauguin had escalated, leaving Vincent in the grip of confusion, despair, and exhaustion. Friends and doctors advised rest. His family intervened. Against his own stubborn will, he was admitted to the Saint-Paul de Mosole asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, a quiet place on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by olive groves, cypress trees, and sun-drenched fields. The asylum itself was a blend of constraint and sanctuary. Walled gardens and orderly corridors offered safety, yet the very structure symbolized the limits Vincent had struggled against his whole life. He was no longer free to wander endlessly, to paint with the boundless energy of Arles, to immerse himself in color without restriction. Yet, paradoxically, this confinement became a catalyst. Within these walls, Vincent faced both his torment and his liberation. Vincent's early months at Saint-Rémy were turbulent. His insomnia returned, often keeping him awake through entire nights. Episodes of hallucination and anxiety struck unpredictably, and he sometimes painted feverishly for hours in the small room he was allowed to occupy. Yet, amid the chaos, he began to channel his intensity into the asylum's gardens and surrounding landscapes. He walked among the cypress trees, the wheat fields, and the distant Alpilles mountains, translating the contours, colors, and light into brushstrokes that conveyed both external observation and internal emotion. He painted the asylum's gardens, capturing their twisted olive branches, gnarled cypresses, and luminous skies. The work was radical. The lines seemed to pulse with life, the colors vibrated with emotion, and the composition suggested movement that no human eye could perceive directly. Historians often note that these paintings were not just representations. They were expressions of the artist's psychological state. Some claim that his swirling, restless brushstrokes were reflections of his inner turmoil, while others argue they were deliberate experiments in rhythm, pattern, and intensity. Debate continues to this day. One of the most iconic subjects of Saint-Rémy was the cypresses. Vincent painted them with a verticality that contrasted sharply against the rolling hills. Their forms twisted and reached skyward, as if resisting the horizon's calm. He wrote to Theo that he found them both terrifying and beautiful, symbols of eternal life and human vulnerability intertwined. The cypresses, with their dark green, almost brooding presence, were a mirror of his own psyche. Steadfast, yet haunted. The asylum routine offered structure, but Vincent rebelled against it creatively. He painted rapidly, sometimes producing 2 or 3 canvases in a single day. He experimented with texture, applying thick impasto in some areas and thin flowing lines in others. Colors became more expressive. Ultramarine blues contrasted with fiery oranges and vibrant yellows, creating compositions that seemed to glow with internal light. He wrote that he painted not just what he saw, but what I feel about what I see. This philosophy became a hallmark of his work and distinguishes his Saint-Rémy period from the earlier Arles landscapes. In addition to landscapes, he created intimate studies of everyday objects and interiors. The irises in the asylum's garden, for example, became subjects of extraordinary intensity. He painted them in deep purples, ultramarines, and greens, each petal alive with motion, light, and emotion. The flowers were more than botanical studies. They were symbols of hope, resilience, and the persistence of beauty amid adversity. Oddly, Vincent sometimes repainted the same iris multiple times on one canvas, layering them almost obsessively, as though trying to capture every nuance of their life and energy. Despite the tranquility of the natural surroundings, the mental battles continued. Vincent experienced episodes of self-doubt, paranoia, and emotional collapse. There were days when he could barely hold a brush. There were nights when he painted until his hand ached and the moonlight blurred the pigments. Letters from Saint-Remy reveal a man both haunted and inspired, deeply aware of his own instability. He wrote to Theo about the fear of losing himself entirely, yet also described the exhilaration of capturing light and colour that seemed to exist only in his perception. Vincent's approach during this period was radical in another sense. He blurred boundaries between observation and imagination. The landscapes of Saint-Remy were recognizable, yet the skies swirled, the trees twisted unnaturally, and the colours defied literal description. The Starry Night over the Rhône precursor works, though not yet the famous Starry Night of later years, demonstrated an interest in rhythm and motion in the sky, a focus on conveying emotion rather than simple replication. Scholars continue to debate whether this approach was born primarily from mental instability, deliberate artistic innovation, or a combination of both. Interestingly, Vincent's productivity in Saint-Remy was punctuated by intense bursts of creativity, often following periods of extreme emotional distress. He called these moments flashes of energy, and in letters to Theo he described them as almost mystical, periods when the canvas became a conduit for something beyond himself. The contrast between confinement and freedom, between stillness and frenzy, gave the works an intensity unmatched in his earlier career. In addition to painting the landscape, Vincent explored interiors of the asylum, depicting empty chairs, beds, and tables in compositions suffused with emotion. A simple wooden chair could convey solitude, presence, or the weight of absence. He painted objects as if they were extensions of the human spirit, assigning them dignity and emotional significance. This focus on the emotional resonance of objects would influence later artists and even contemporary design, as theorists argue that Vincent's approach to composition and colour prefigured certain aspects of modern visual storytelling. Despite his confinement, Vincent remained connected to the outside world through letters. Theo's continued support provided both practical assistance and moral encouragement. Vincent's correspondence from this period is full of reflection, self-analysis, and almost obsessive detail about his painting process. He described mixing colours in minute variations, experimenting with brushwork to capture light and motion, and struggling to balance his emotional state with creative output. By the end of his first year in Saint-Remy, Vincent had produced over 150 paintings, landscapes, gardens, and interiors that would later define the Saint-Remy period. The works combine observation, emotion, and imaginative expression in a way that had no precedent. The hospital grounds, cypress trees, wheat fields, and flower beds became the stage for his exploration of light, rhythm, and colour as emotional language. The Saint-Remy period is also notable for its deep exploration of psychological intensity. Art historians continue to debate whether Vincent's swirling skies and vibrant contrasts were manifestations of mental illness, deliberate stylistic choices, or both. Regardless, It was during this period that he began to master the ability to translate inner experience into visual form, an ability that would culminate in the masterpieces of his final months in Auvers-sur-Oise. By the time he left Saint-Rémy, Vincent had transformed not only his techniques but his vision of what art could be. He had learned that confinement could spark creativity, that struggle could fuel intensity, and that even in the shadow of madness, colour, form, and light could convey profound emotional truth. His Saint-Rémy period remains a testament to the delicate balance between genius and fragility, the interplay of mental turbulence and artistic triumph. Here, amidst cypresses, wheat fields, and irises, Vincent van Gogh became fully himself, a painter who saw beyond appearances, who transformed the mundane into the extraordinary, and who demonstrated that even in darkness, light could be captured, amplified, and shared. In May 1890, Vincent van Gogh left the relative sanctuary of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence and travelled north to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small village perched on the hills outside Paris. Here he sought both fresh inspiration and medical oversight from Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician and amateur painter known for his understanding of mental fragility and creative temperament. The village itself was quaint, winding streets lined with thatched cottages, quiet cafes with rickety tables, and fields that rolled like waves under the changing sky. For Vincent, Auvers was a new stage, a landscape that combined both rural charm and the subtle drama of light and shadow, perfect for his relentless pursuit of capturing emotion on canvas. Almost immediately, Vincent's productivity surged. The move to Auvers marked what historians often call his final burst, a period of feverish painting that would produce over 70 canvases in a mere 70 days. The pace was relentless. He rose with the dawn, traversing muddy paths to sketch fields, cottages, and wheat sheaves, and returned in the evening to apply thick, textured brushstrokes in a whirlwind of colour and emotion. It was as if he knew that time was fleeting and that every day had to be translated into paint. One of the central motifs of this period was the wheat field, often painted under various lights and skies. In wheat field with crows, the horizon stretches infinitely, the golden stalks bending under the wind, and black crows scatter across the sky like living punctuation. The painting pulsates with tension, yet also with life. It is a study of movement, a reflection of nature's rhythm, and simultaneously an intimate window into Vincent's emotional state. Scholars have debated whether the ominous crows symbolize foreboding or simply the natural presence of birds in the landscape, illustrating the ongoing mystery of his inner life. Beyond the fields, Vincent explored village life and architecture with unprecedented focus. The small streets of Auvers, the steep roofs of the homes, and the stone walls of the church became compositional studies of perspective and colour. In works like the church at Auvers, he used bold outlines and contrasting colours to make the structure both monumental and intimate. He transformed the familiar into something extraordinary, emphasizing the dynamic interaction of light, shadow, and structure. Even though these subjects were ordinary, Vincent's treatment rendered them extraordinary, imbued with vibrancy and emotional resonance. During this period, Vincent also focused on portraits, particularly those of Dr. Gachet and local villagers. He captured their expressions, postures, and even the nuances of their environment, bringing a psychological depth that was rare for the era. Dr. Gachet, himself a collector of art, became a muse and a confidant. The portrait of the doctor reveals a figure simultaneously compassionate and weary, a reflection of both the sitter and the painter's intense gaze. Some art historians suggest that the psychological tension in these portraits hints at Vincent's own awareness of his fragile condition, a tension that resonates through the brushstrokes and the layering of colour. Vincent's fascination with nature in motion was also evident. Trees bent under the wind, wheat fields shimmered with undulating energy, and skies churned in vibrant blues and yellows. In Daubigny's garden, he transformed a simple cultivated plot into a symphony of colour, pattern, and movement. Every leaf, every flower, every shadow was rendered with a deliberate rhythm, conveying a sense of life as a continuous pulse. Critics have debated whether this visual rhythm was purely aesthetic or an externalization of Vincent's inner emotional cycles, a question that continues to spark discussion in art scholarship. In addition to fields and portraits, Vincent turned to everyday objects and interiors, revisiting motifs from earlier periods, but now amplified in intensity. Chairs, vases, and tables were imbued with presence, sometimes rendered with exaggerated outlines or unexpected color contrasts. These objects, once ordinary, became symbolic carriers of human experience, a language through which Vincent communicated emotion, solitude, and the fleeting beauty of ordinary life. Scholars note that his treatment of these objects in oeuvres reflects a maturation of his post-impressionist approach, blending observation with heightened emotional resonance. Vincent's colour palette in Auvers was notably more dynamic and experimental than in any previous period. Deep ultramarines, blazing yellows, and fiery oranges vibrated alongside muted greens and browns. He juxtaposed complementary colours with deliberate intensity, creating canvases that almost shimmered with internal light. Some contemporaries considered the boldness excessive or jarring, but Vincent embraced the tension. In letters, he described how colour could express what words cannot, a philosophy that guided every brush stroke and compositional choice during these final months. Yet, even amid such creative brilliance, his mental turbulence persisted. Observers in the village noted moments of agitation, withdrawal, and obsessive focus. He could walk miles in a day, sketching every field, every hedge, every distant roof, only to return exhausted and immerse himself in paint for hours. Letters to Theo reveal that he struggled with insomnia and alternating waves of elation and despair. While some biographers interpret these behaviors as signs of deteriorating mental health, others argue they reflect an almost supernatural intensity of vision, a drive to translate every aspect of life into art before time ran out. One of the remarkable features of this period is Vincent's engagement with perspective and motion. In paintings such as Road with Cypress and Star, the trees and pathways twist and stretch toward the horizon, creating a dynamic energy that captures the viewer's eye. These distortions were not errors, they were deliberate manipulations to express emotional resonance. The physical world became a stage for inner life, and the landscape was no longer passive, it pulsed, breathed, and communicated. Even the simplest natural elements, clouds, grass, fences, were imbued with vitality. Vincent's brush captured the flicker of sunlight on a roof, the way a shadow stretched across a field, or the ripple of wind through a wheat stalk. He explored patterns, repetition, and rhythm in ways that prefigured modern abstraction, yet always rooted in observation. These works demonstrate that, in his final months, Vincent was pushing the boundaries of visual expression, synthesizing the lessons of Arles, Saint-Remy, and Paris into a language uniquely his own. Interestingly, while his subjects remained deeply personal and localized, Vincent also contemplated universality. He wanted his art to speak to human emotion, to communicate resilience, fragility, hope, and despair. Even in the simplicity of a wheat field, he saw life's grandeur and its impermanence. Scholars continue to debate how consciously he pursued this philosophical dimension, but there is no question that Auvers marked the peak of his synthesis of observation, colour, and emotion. The final burst of activity in Auvers was not without its tension. Vincent's letters hint at a man acutely aware of the fragility of life, yet determined to paint as if every moment mattered. Days were measured by canvases completed, walks taken, skies observed, and letters written. Nights were often restless, filled with contemplation, doubt, and bursts of creative energy. The pressure of this intensity produced paintings of extraordinary depth and vibrancy, capturing both the external world and the inner workings of the artist's mind. In sum, the Auvers period represents the culmination of Vincent van Gogh's artistic journey. Every element, colour, light, brushstroke, composition, coalesced into a language capable of expressing the profound complexity of human experience. It was a time of both creative triumph and psychological strain, a moment where genius and fragility intersected with unprecedented intensity. Vincent's final months in Auvers would leave a legacy that continues to captivate the world. Paintings that pulse with emotion, vibrate with colour, and communicate the ineffable power of life itself. Here in the quiet hills outside Paris, amidst wheat fields, cypress trees, and the slow dance of sunlight and shadow, Vincent van Gogh reached the apex of his creative vision. Each canvas, whether depicting nature, people, or objects, carried the weight of his perception, the intensity of his emotion, and the urgency of a man who saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be felt, vivid, alive, and eternally luminous. Vincent van Gogh's life had always been a tension between brilliance and fragility, intensity and isolation. By the time he left Auvers-sur-Oise, the world had only begun to glimpse the magnitude of his vision. Unlike the immediate recognition many artists receive today, Vincent's work was largely uncelebrated during his lifetime. Letters from Theo, his devoted brother, reveal both the struggle to sell paintings and the relentless drive to create, as if Vincent understood that the value of his work would ultimately transcend any contemporary validation. His posthumous influence is staggering. Within a few decades after his death, collectors, curators, and critics began to recognize the revolutionary nature of his approach. Van Gogh had transformed the way color, brushwork, and emotional resonance could coexist on a single canvas. Artists from the Fauves, like Henri Matisse and André Derain, openly cited his use of bold, emotive color as a catalyst for their own explorations. Expressionists in Germany, including Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and Emil Nolde, studied the intensity of his lines and the raw psychological energy embedded in each brush stroke. It is not merely technique that inspired them, but the philosophy of perception, that an artist could convey feeling as powerfully as reality itself. Vincent's contribution extended beyond the brush. His letters, nearly 900 in total, offer insight into his methods, his philosophical approach to art, and his relentless pursuit of emotional truth. They reveal a man obsessed with capturing life's vibrancy, often articulating ideas that would only later become foundational in modern art. His writing described color as a language, each hue a word, each composition a sentence. These letters influenced not just painters but also writers and theorists who began to see the intersection of emotion and form as a fertile ground for innovation. Scholars continue to debate how intentionally he developed these ideas and how much they emerged organically from his personal struggles, but the enduring impact is undeniable. One fascinating but less discussed aspect of his legacy is his influence on design and visual culture. The bold patterns, contrasts, and textural techniques that Vincent pioneered later informed movements in graphic design, textile design, and even advertising. Designers in the 20th century, especially during the rise of abstract and expressionist visual languages, cited his work as a model for translating emotion into visual impact. The thick, dynamic brushstrokes and vivid colors of his paintings inspired not only posters and book illustrations, but also early cinematic set designs, where color and mood became central storytelling tools. The link between his painterly techniques and visual communication is a testament to the universality of his vision. Vincent's color theory, though largely intuitive, remains a subject of academic fascination. He understood the psychological resonance of complementary and contrasting hues. His paintings are studies in tension and balance. The deep blue of a twilight sky set against blazing yellow sunflowers, or the fiery orange of a wheat field balanced by the muted greens of olive trees. Art historians debate whether Vincent fully grasped the scientific principles behind these choices, or if he was guided purely by emotional instinct. Regardless, the results are undeniable. Canvases that vibrate with energy, communicate mood, and engage viewers in a visceral, almost synesthetic experience. Van Gogh also revolutionized the perception of subject matter. Before him, everyday life, chairs, boots, fences, and modest cottages, was often considered trivial or unworthy of high art. Vincent elevated these objects, treating them with reverence and psychological depth. Chairs could convey loneliness or the presence of a soul. Simple boots could reflect toil, character, and human endurance. In doing so, he expanded the boundaries of what art could encompass, influencing subsequent generations of artists who sought to depict life as lived rather than as idealized. Scholars debate whether this focus stemmed from aesthetic choice or a deeper philosophical impulse, but its impact is clear. Everyday objects became worthy of meditation and artistic attention. An intriguing, often overlooked part of his influence is the cross-cultural inspiration he drew from Japanese prints. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, with their flattened perspectives, bold outlines, and attention to pattern, informed his composition and use of space. Vincent absorbed these principles and reinterpreted them through his emotional lens. Later, scholars argue, this fusion of Eastern visual strategy with Western emotive intensity prefigured modernism itself, demonstrating that global art traditions could intertwine in new expressive ways. Vincent's impact was not limited to painters and designers. It extended to the very way audiences interact with art. He demanded engagement, emotional participation, and reflection. Standing before a canvas like Starry Night or Wheatfield with Crows, viewers confront not just scenery, but the painter's inner life. He transformed the passive act of looking into an active, immersive experience. Critics note that he pioneered a psychological intimacy in art, long before the term expressive realism became widespread. Another layer of his legacy is the way he redefined artistic labor and dedication. Vincent's relentless work ethic, his willingness to endure mental anguish for the sake of capturing his vision, set a precedent that inspired both admiration and caution. Artists today often cite his letters and practices as evidence of the necessity of immersion, commitment, and emotional authenticity. The debate persists in academic circles. Was Vincent a cautionary tale of genius consumed by instability, or a model of uncompromising dedication to art? Scholars continue to argue this point, but his example remains potent, particularly for those striving to balance personal struggle with creative output. Vincent's stylistic evolution, from dark, somber Dutch beginnings to luminous, emotionally charged colour, also informs art education and pedagogy. Students study the progression not just to understand technique, but to explore the interplay between personal growth, emotional exploration, and artistic output. Art academies worldwide use his trajectory to illustrate the relationship between experimentation, mentorship, as with his time in Paris, and the pursuit of a unique voice. By charting this evolution, educators demonstrate how perseverance, curiosity, and emotional honesty can coalesce into artistic innovation. Furthermore, Vincent's influence resonates in modern psychology of creativity. His life has been analyzed as an extreme case of the intersection between mental illness and creative genius. Researchers study his letters and diaries not to diagnose, but to understand the cognitive, emotional, and perceptual mechanisms that allowed him to produce such a vast body of work under immense personal strain. Questions remain open. How much did his suffering amplify his perception of colour and form? Could the intensity of his vision have existed without his emotional volatility? These are debates that continue in both artistic and psychological scholarship, underscoring the complexity of his legacy. Vincent's posthumous fame eventually turned into a cultural phenomenon. Exhibitions, reproductions, and popular references spread worldwide. The images of sunflowers, swirling skies, and cypresses entered collective consciousness, becoming symbolic of human passion, struggle, and beauty. Yet, the stories behind these paintings, the letters, the obsessive work, the bursts of creative energy amid despair, are equally important. They remind us that art is inseparable from the artist, that each brushstroke carries the weight of intention, emotion, and lived experience. In essence, Vincent van Gogh's legacy is multifaceted. He redefined colour, form, subject matter, emotional resonance, and the role of the artist in society. His influence spans painting, design, literature, psychology, and cultural imagination. He challenged conventions, embraced experimentation, and lived with the uncompromising urgency of a man who understood that life was fleeting and colour was eternal. Art historians continue to debate the precise reasons for his stylistic choices, the extent of his psychological influence on his work, and the philosophical intentions behind his compositions. Yet all agree on one thing: his vision altered the course of modern art forever. Standing before a Van Gogh today, whether in a museum or a reproduced print, viewers encounter not just a painted scene but the distilled essence of his life. Every struggle, every insight, every burst of joy and despair. The legacy is living, evolving, and boundless. Vincent van Gogh did more than paint. He taught the world to see, to feel colour, to perceive emotion, and to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary. Looking back across the arc of Vincent van Gogh's life, one is struck by the intensity of his vision, the relentlessness of his pursuit, and the extraordinary range of his emotional and artistic expression. From his early studies in the Netherlands to his luminous final works in Auvers-sur-Oise, Vincent's journey embodies both human vulnerability and transcendent creativity. The narrative is not only a story of paintings, but of perception, emotion, and the unyielding search for meaning in the world around him. In the decades since his death, Van Gogh has become a symbol of artistic authenticity, someone who pursued his vision uncompromisingly, even in the face of misunderstanding, poverty, and illness. His paintings, letters, and life story collectively present a portrait of a man who saw deeply, felt intensely, and expressed without hesitation. His oeuvre is often studied not just for technique, but for the philosophy that underpins it, that art should reflect the inner life as faithfully as the outer world. In this sense, every brushstroke, every composition, every choice of color carries the weight of intention and emotion, creating a direct line from the artist's perception to the viewer's experience. Vincent's posthumous fame has elevated him to iconic status, yet understanding his brilliance requires more than admiration. It requires immersion in the rhythm of his life, the cycles of his creativity, and the turbulence of his emotions. Scholars continue to debate the ways in which his mental state shaped his work. Were the swirling skies, pulsating colors, and agitated brushstrokes products of psychological intensity, deliberate artistic innovation, or a combination of both? This ongoing discussion underscores the complexity of his genius. His art cannot be separated from his life, nor his life from the art he created. An often overlooked aspect of Vincent's legacy is the methodical nature of his practice. Despite his reputation for impulsive creativity, letters and surviving sketches show a disciplined mind at work. He repeatedly studied color combinations, experimented with brush techniques, and analyzed the effects of light and perspective. Even during periods of apparent mania or despair, there was a method to his approach, a constant probing of how visual elements could convey emotional truth. Some of his most seemingly spontaneous works were the result of hours of preparation, reflection, and experimentation, a testament to his intellectual as well as emotional engagement with painting. Vincent's influence reaches far beyond painting alone. His approach to color, form, and emotion has shaped modern design, cinema, and visual storytelling. Designers have drawn on his techniques to communicate mood, movement, and psychological nuance. Filmmakers have cited his dynamic compositions and use of color to convey inner states of characters or the energy of a setting. Even literature and poetry have been enriched by his perspective. The way he saw detail and emotional resonance in ordinary life provides a template for immersive, sensory-rich narrative. Vincent's genius was not confined to canvases. It radiated across cultural domains, inspiring countless creators in multiple fields. One particularly striking aspect of his brilliance is his treatment of ordinary subjects with extraordinary depth. Chairs, boots, wheat fields, cypresses, and village streets become carriers of emotion and narrative. In elevating the everyday, Vincent transformed perception itself. Viewers are invited to see life not as a backdrop, but as an active, vibrant, and emotionally resonant experience. This philosophy anticipates later movements in modern art, from abstract expressionism to conceptual and installation work, which also sought to imbue the mundane with significance. The debate remains whether this vision was consciously philosophical or instinctively emotional, but its effect is indisputable. Vincent's letters, particularly those to his brother Theo, provide unparalleled insight into the mind of a creative genius. They reveal a man deeply reflective, acutely aware of the fragility of life, and yet relentlessly optimistic about the possibilities of art. He discussed the symbolic potential of colors, the interplay of lines and forms, and the emotional power of composition. Some letters describe minute observations of light on a roof, the tilt of a fence, or the subtle curvature of a wheat stalk, emphasizing his extraordinary attention to detail. Others reveal his vulnerabilities, moments of despair, self-doubt, and existential questioning. Together, these letters form a companion to the visual legacy, providing context and depth that illuminate the genius behind the works. Vincent's life also serves as a reflection on the intersection of genius and suffering. The intensity of his creativity was inextricably linked to his emotional turbulence. Scholars, psychologists, and historians continue to analyze how his mental state influenced perception, color choice, and compositional daring. The ongoing debate raises profound questions. Does suffering enhance creativity, or is it simply a condition that many geniuses share? Can art exist at the intersection of brilliance and fragility without one consuming the other? Vincent's life provides no simple answers, only evidence of the delicate, often precarious balance between vision and vulnerability. In terms of artistic technique, Vincent synthesized multiple influences into a language uniquely his own. Early Dutch realism provided a foundation, while his Paris period introduced him to impressionism and pointillist experimentation. The influence of Japanese prints enriched his compositional perspective, emphasizing line, pattern, and spatial organization. Finally, his experiences in Arles, Saint-Rémy, and Auvers allowed him to merge observation with emotion, producing a style that was vibrant, expressive, and psychologically resonant. This evolution illustrates not just technical mastery, but the ability to absorb, transform, and innovate, creating a body of work that continues to inspire study and imitation. Vincent's impact on subsequent generations of artists cannot be overstated. Expressionists, fauves, abstract painters, and modern visual storytellers have all traced elements of their own work back to Van Gogh. The courage to distort, exaggerate, and heighten reality in pursuit of emotional truth is perhaps his most enduring lesson. Furthermore, his willingness to devote himself entirely to the craft, despite adversity and lack of recognition, serves as a model for commitment and resilience in creative practice. The universality of his appeal is striking. People respond to Vincent not only because of his vivid colors or dynamic brushwork, but because they perceive his humanity. His canvases carry the weight of lived experience, hope, despair, joy, and contemplation. Observing a Van Gogh painting is simultaneously an aesthetic, emotional, and existential encounter. Viewers witness the world through his eyes, sharing in his perception, his intensity, and his relentless search for beauty and meaning. As we reflect on his legacy, it is clear that Vincent van Gogh transcends his time and medium. His paintings, letters, and vision continue to speak to universal human experience. The swirling skies, golden fields, and intimate objects he painted are more than artistic accomplishments. They are meditations on life, perception, and emotional resonance. The debates surrounding his mental state, technique, and philosophical intent will likely continue indefinitely. Yet they add richness rather than diminish the impact of his work. Vincent's brilliance lies not only in his technical skill, but in his ability to transform perception itself. He invites us to see ordinary life with extraordinary intensity, to feel the pulse of nature, and to recognize the profound beauty embedded in seemingly mundane moments. His legacy is a living testament to the power of art, to convey emotion, evoke reflection, and bridge the gap between inner experience and outer reality. As the story of his life concludes, we are left with a sense of quiet awe. The intensity of his vision, the depth of his emotion, and the brilliance of his technique remain vivid across time and space. In this reflection, Vincent van Gogh is not only an artist but a guide, showing us that the world can be seen, felt, and expressed with unparalleled depth and sincerity. His life and work remind us that even in struggle, even amid uncertainty, beauty and insight can emerge, eternally luminous and profoundly moving. As we slowly step back from the whirlwind of Vincent van Gogh's life, it is worth letting the world he painted settle around us like a soft twilight over a golden field. Imagine the gentle sway of wheat under a late summer breeze, the quiet curl of stars above a small village, the warm flickering light that dances across a worn chair, all elements of a world he saw with extraordinary intensity. In this moment, there is no rush, no judgment, only the slow rhythmic pulse of life as it flows through colour, texture, and form. Vincent's paintings, letters, and vision remind us that every ordinary detail can carry profound meaning, that even the simplest objects and moments can reflect the depth of human feeling. Close your eyes and picture his cypresses bending with the wind, the golden sunflowers glowing like tiny suns, and the sky swirling above in blues and yellows that almost hum with motion. In these scenes, we sense not only the outer world, but the inner rhythm of the artist, a heart that loved, a mind that questioned, and hands that transformed observation into eternity. The turbulence of his life, the flashes of brilliance and despair, the relentless pursuit of expression, all fold into a quiet understanding. Art is a living bridge between what we see, what we feel, and what we carry inside. And now, as the day fades and your mind begins to drift, let the colours linger softly behind your closed eyelids. Imagine walking along one of Vincent's winding village streets, or resting in a sunlit wheat field, the textures and hues blending into a gentle, comforting hum. Let his vision carry you into the stillness where imagination, emotion, and quiet reflection mingle. Breathe slowly, feel the calm, and know that the world Vincent painted, vibrant, tender, and infinitely alive, is always there for you to revisit. Sleep now, gently, as if cradled in the warmth of his painted skies.